Shabbat Shalom. So some of you may have heard a lecture some years ago at B'nai Shalom of Olney. We used to have, well, we still do, a lecture before Slichot, and a bunch of shul get together. And this was at B'nai Shalom of Olney, and it was Professor Benjamin Summers, who teaches Bible at JTS. And his lecture, and I just remembered this because I'm quoting from something that he wrote about this week's Parsha, but I just remembered this. The lecture that he gave, which struck me as brilliant. I mean, the rabbis loved it. I don't know to what extent everybody else did, but he explained, okay, what we just did, right? What the heck was that? Okay, what the heck was that? That psalm that we sing and we carry the Torah around and everybody kisses it. What's that all about, right? And he said that in ancient Near Eastern cultures that were polytheistic and idolatrous, they would parade their God through the people, and everybody would come and kiss it, and then they would deposit the God back in the shrine, right? And our ancestors couldn't imagine not doing that, right? And I have to say, you know, something like that is very impressive. Back in 2017, Kelly and I, on a Sunday, stumbled across in Chapala, Mexico, the procession in honor of the Virgin of Zapopan. Okay, and I mean, nothing more pagan, right? Even though in theory they're Christian, right? But it was impressive and amazing, right? And totally pagan and idolatrous, but impressive and amazing. So our ancestors said, well, we can't imagine like not doing it, right? But we can't parade God through the town because God is incorporeal. So what are we going to do, right? And the closest thing is to parade the Torah. Right, and the parade the Torah through the town, and the people pay homage to it, and then we redeposit it in its shrine. Okay, so that's what's going on. It's a Judaification, if you will, of a pagan practice, and it was fascinating. Okay, it was, and it, you know, I don't know if that helped me like have more spirituality when we do this, or less spirituality, but at least, you know, I now understand what's going on, and now so do you. Okay, so Professor Benji Summers from JTS says the following: there are probably no Torah readings as widely misunderstood as the Torah readings for this week and next week. Parashat Tazria and Parashat Mitzvah. These parshiot are devoted entirely to the subject of ritual purity. They discuss what causes people to become ritually impure, how they can become ritually pure again, and what the effects of this state are. For many modern readers, this topic is off-putting. It seems primitive and far removed from the real concerns of an ethical and monotheistic religion. And Professor Summers doesn't mention this, but this idea of ritual purity is often an occasion for Christians to caricature Judaism as all about ritual and not about justice and mercy. And they point to the story of the Good Samaritan, okay, which, I mean, I was shocked to discover how, like, even Christians who are favorably disposed to Judaism read this story. I can't retell the whole story right now, right? But the priest and the Kohen and the Levi, right, walk by this Jewish guy who is injured, and they don't want to help him. And who helps him instead? The Samaritan, right? And it'd be like the 1950s, a story about the good communist or the good Russian, right? That the Americans walk by because they don't care, but the Russian helps him, right? And Christians like say that the reason that the Kohen and the Levi didn't want to help is because they didn't want to contract ritual impurity in case the guy died. Okay, and I mean, I have to say, I was so astonished, right? And I remember studying this with a close friend of mine who's a Methodist minister. I said, that's not it at all. They don't want to help him because they're jerks and they're in a hurry, right? That's all. It's not about ritual purity, right? People of any religion can be jerks, right? And that's what's going on, okay? So, I mean, I'm getting angry as I retell the story, right? Because it's shocking, okay? But these are obviously important to the author of the Bible, and they're intertwined with the idea of monotheism, right? And because of menstrual impurity, right? So, like, how many times have you heard, oh, a woman can't touch the Torah because she might be having her period, right? Or, you know, a book that, like, every Jewish woman in the world read when it came out, the Red Tent, right? Very good book based on nothing, okay? Women were not banished from the community when they were menstruating, right? Lo haya v'lo nivra, right? It never existed. Okay, another misconception, the book of Leviticus frowns on ritual impurity, right? It considers ritual impurity as objectionable or forbidden, right? But that's not it at all. It tells you how you get it, and it tells you how you get rid of it. It doesn't say, like, avoid getting it, right? In fact, there's the story how we got Pesach Sheni, right? Some men had buried a corpse, and now they're ritually impure and they can't partake in the Paschal sacrifice. And they go to Moses, and what is it? This isn't fair. Okay, why isn't it fair? Because burying somebody's a mitzvah, right? I performed a mitzvah, and now I'm punished, and I can't go to the Korban Pesach. And Moses says, oh, you're right. Okay, so we'll have another Pesach a month later, right? And some causes of impurity were actually meritorious, and others were simply inevitable, right? If you come into contact with the dead body of a non-kosher animal, that causes ritual impurity, right? Okay, fine. Your donkey just died, right? What are you supposed to do, right? Leave it to rot in the field? No, you bury your donkey, right? You got to get rid of the carcass. You bury it, or you burn it, or whatever, but you got to get rid of the carcass, right? And Leviticus doesn't forbid farmers from getting rid of a dead donkey or family members from preparing a loved one's body for burial, nor does it prohibit women from having their normal bodily functions, right? Ritual impurity is a normal state that's perfectly permissible in biblical law, but you can't enter the tabernacle or the temple in a state of ritual impurity, right? And it happened, right? So, and I've mentioned this before, and people object sometimes, but it's still true. All right, biblical monotheism does not posit that other gods don't exist, right? If you look at Naaman, right, he said, now I know that Adonai is the strongest God, right? We sing what? Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, right? And our Siddurim translated all kinds of ways to avoid translating what it really says, right? Who is like you, Adonai, among all the gods, right? The other gods exist, but our God is strongest, right? And there is a key difference between Hashem and other gods, okay, which pagan gods do, okay? And pay attention, I mean, I think it's brilliant, okay? This is not me, it's someone, right? There are 4 things which cause ritual impurity, which pagan gods do, which our God does not do, okay? And incidentally, and again, Summers is more polite than I, but some of these are attributed to Jesus, right? Which, again, demonstrates that Christianity is in many ways a fusion of Jewish ideas and pagan ideas. Okay, now what are the 4 things that pagan gods do that the true God doesn't do, all of which cause ritual impurity? Be born, have sex, give birth, and die. Okay, right? And at least 2 of those are attributed to Jesus, right? He was born and he died. Whether he had sex or not, I don't know. Okay, but so all these things, being born, having sex, giving birth, and dying, cause ritual impurity. Okay, and God doesn't do that. And if you have ritual impurity, you're not morally corrupt, you're not a bad person, but you can't come into the temple. Okay, why? All right, and here's what Professor Summers says. Let's assume that while visiting London, for some reason, he wrote this some years ago, so it's semi-archaic now, you're invited to have dinner with the Queen, okay? But earlier in the day, you went to the exercise room in your hotel, and you used the Stairmaster for 30 minutes, and then the rowing machine, and then some weights. Okay, my guess is that before you go to Buckingham Palace, you're going to take a shower and put on clean clothes. Okay, there's nothing wrong with sweat. In fact, health-wise, there's a lot that's good about sweating, but we don't wear sweaty gym clothes to dinner with the Queen, right? And these rules tell us that even when God becomes immanent, right, when God chooses to dwell with us, because our ancestors actually really did believe that when they built the tabernacle, that's where God lived, right? And you can see Solomon also, when he builds the temple, thinks that's where God lives, okay? And but so God becomes immanent, God consents to dwell with us, but God nevertheless remains transcendent, right? The central idea of Leviticus, Professor Summers says, is divine grace. Okay? God graciously explains to us how to bring God into the world so that we have the privilege of being God's neighbor, but this gracious God remains in charge, and thus, if we want to come close to God, we have to do so on God's terms, even if they don't make any sense to us, right? God is nearby, but impossible to literally, physically embrace. right? So the detailed laws of purity in Leviticus are a very concrete form of theology, which convey essential ideas about biblical monotheism, right? And I'll summarize it again. God dwells with us, but God is still transcendent, right? Other, inapproachable. And if we want to, God tells us what we need to do to assist God in dwelling among us, right? And in the ancient world, it was a tabernacle, right? And now it's prayer and it's Torah study and it's ma'asim tovim, good deeds, right? And when we do these things, we bring God down into the world and God agrees to be our neighbor. But nevertheless, it's on God's terms, right? God is close, but not physical, that we can embrace us. And most of these laws no longer apply, right? Because we don't have a temple anymore. But by studying them, and by studying them, you know, really the way that Professor Summers explains them, right? We learn something about them, and thus we understand something about God's closeness, God's distance, God's grace, and God's will. Shabbat shalom.